The light slanted through the lace curtains in my front parlor, painting delicate patterns across the oak floorboards. I stood at the mirror in the hallway, fastening the small brooch Dorian had given me on our 30th anniversary. 72 years behind me, and yet the flutter in my chest felt almost girlish. Tonight, after so many strained months, Maribel had invited me to dinner. I wanted to believe it was more than duty, that perhaps my daughter truly wanted peace between us. I moved slowly through the rooms of my Victorian house, each one still carrying his touch, the bookshelves Dorian had built, the creak in the stair he used to complain about, but never fixed. I straightened a picture frame of us in the hallway before reaching for my coat. The thought of reconciliation carried me toward the door. Just as I bent to tie my scarf, I heard the faint scrape of paper sliding under the door. Startled, I stooped and picked it up. The envelope was unmarked, thin, smelling faintly of damp. Inside was a single sheet, words scrawled in uneven ink. "Don't trust tonight. They want your house." For a moment, the room spun. My hands shook so badly the note nearly slipped from my fingers. I told myself it was nonsense, an ugly prank from a neighbor boy. Perhaps, but why now? Of all nights, I looked around the quiet hallway, as if the walls themselves might answer. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, indifferent to my sudden dread. I set the note aside, refusing to let fear take root. Still, unease pressed down as I lifted my purse. My phone buzzed on the entryway table. A message from Gideon Lark, my lawyer of 20 years. "Call me immediately." The air seemed to thicken around me. I sank onto the bench by the door, pulse hammering in my ears. With trembling fingers, I pressed his number, holding the phone tight as though it might anchor me against what I already feared was true. "Claudine?" Gideon's voice came sharp the moment he picked up. No greeting, no polite preamble. "I need you to listen carefully. This cannot wait." My heart thudded. "What is it?" "Gideon." He exhaled heavily, the sound of papers shuffling in the background. "Your daughter came to see me this week." Maribel sat in my office asking questions. No child should be asking about a living parent. She wanted to know if you were still legally competent. She asked whether a will could be challenged if someone claimed you weren't of sound mind. The note still lay on the bench beside me. My throat tightened as I forced out. She said that she didn't say it outright. Gideon continued, but the implication was clear. "Claudine, she is preparing for something, whether it's contesting your estate or forcing you out of your home. I don't want to alarm you, but you need to be aware." Dorian's voice rose in memory, as if carried through the creaking beams of the old house. "Protect the house. It's your fortress." I had heard him say it so often, half jokingly, when the mortgage was heavy and repairs endless. Now the words felt like prophecy. I pressed a hand against my chest. "She invited me to dinner tonight." I thought the words caught. I had thought she wanted peace. "Go carefully," Gideon said, his tone softer now. "Do nothing rash. Keep your eyes open. And Claudine, don't sign a single scrap of paper." I promised him I wouldn't, though the promise tasted bitter. Hanging up. I sat in silence, the tick of the clock suddenly louder than before. Canceling would feel like admitting fear, and I could not bear to give Maribel that satisfaction. But going meant stepping into whatever trap she had set. I rose slowly, tucking the ominous note into my purse. If my daughter meant to test me, I would meet her eyes and let her see that I was not as fragile as she believed. And so I lifted my coat from the hook and prepared to face her table. The walk from the hallway to my car felt longer than it should have, each step echoing with memories that rose unbidden. Betrayal never comes to you fresh. It drags behind it the weight of every sacrifice you once made willingly. When Maribel was small, Dorian worked sunrise to dusk on the construction sites, his hands cracked and calloused. his back always bent under the strain of labor. That left me to manage the home, the bills, and the little girl who looked at me with wide eyes, trusting me to give her the world. I worked nights at the diner on Maple Avenue, balancing trays heavier than my own arms wanted to carry. I remember counting tips in the half-dark kitchen, whispering promises over her sleeping head. Someday, this will all be for you. Long before that, there had been my own dreams. A scholarship offer to Ohio State, a chance to study history, maybe even teach. I gave it up when my mother fell ill and my brothers needed me. I told myself the door would open again later. It never did. When Maribel arrived, I poured all of that deferred ambition into her. I dipped into the retirement fund I had scraped together to pay for her wedding. I co-signed the loan for her first house when the bank turned her away. I even covered Ethan's lost wages one winter when he claimed his company had downsized. By my last calculation, it was more than $200,000 over the years. Not loans, not debts, gifts. Because that's what mothers do, isn't it? We give and give, believing love is the currency that will balance the books. Now, Gideon's words echoed like a cruel rebuke. Not competent. Contest the will. Had my generosity been nothing more than training her to take, I gripped the steering wheel, staring down the quiet street. And for the first time in my life, I felt the ledger of motherhood tilt sharply against me. I turned the key in the ignition, ready to drive toward Maribel's house, carrying with me not just suspicion, but the bitter weight of everything I had already given. Maribel's house rose before me like a showroom, all angles and glass, without a trace of the warmth I remembered from her childhood home. The porch lights blazed too brightly, as if they had been timed to announce my arrival. She opened the door before I knocked, her smile wide, her arms outstretched. The sudden sweetness in her tone felt unfamiliar, almost practiced. "Mother, you look wonderful," she said, pressing her cheek to mine. Ethan stood behind her, hands in his pockets, watching me with a politeness that didn't reach his eyes. Inside, the dining room table glittered with silverware and polished glasses. A bouquet of lilies filled the air with heavy fragrance. My favorite dishes, ones I hadn't tasted in years, lined the table: chicken pot pie, roasted carrots with honey glaze, even a lemon tart. It should have touched me, but instead, it set my nerves on edge. Maribel had never been this thoughtful. Not without a reason. Ethan poured wine into my glass before I could refuse. "For a toast," he said smoothly. I raised it, letting the rim touch my lips, and then placed it down again. My stomach twisted as I noticed Maribel watching too closely. Midway through the meal, as conversation faltered into forced cheer, a small hand brushed mine. Isolde leaned over from her chair, slipping a folded napkin into my lap. Her eyes met mine only for a second before she turned back to her plate. I unfolded the linen under the table. In hurried handwriting, "Don't drink anything." The room swayed faintly, though I hadn't touched a drop. I pressed the napkin flat against my thigh. Heart pounding. Slowly, I began to mimic sipping, raising the glass to my lips, but never letting the liquid pass. Across from me, Maribel fumbled with a serving spoon. Ethan's hand darted beneath the table, gripping her wrist tightly. Her smile faltered, and I saw the mask slip, the performance beginning to crack. I dabbed my mouth with the napkin, folding Isolde's warning safely inside. The food might have been warm, the lights dazzling, but I knew then I was sitting in the middle of a theater, and the play was not meant for my benefit. When I returned home that night, the house seemed to breathe around me. The floorboards groaned in the same familiar rhythm. The brass clock chimed from the mantel, and the scent of old wood greeted me like an embrace. I set down my coat and went straight to the cabinet where I kept the photo albums. One by one, I traced the spines, pulling out the one marked anniversaries. My fingers trembled as I opened it to the page from our 40th. There we were, Dorian and I, standing in the parlor of this very house, he in his pressed suit, me in a blue dress I had sewn myself, both of us smiling as though time would never have its way with us. The wallpaper behind us is the same. I look at now, faded, but still standing. I flipped further back birthdays in the dining room, Christmas mornings with Maribel tearing into gifts on the rug, Dorian's hands always steady on her shoulders. Every memory seemed tied to a corner of these rooms, woven into the plaster, nailed into the beams. The thought of Maribel coveting it, as if it were nothing more than an asset, made my stomach turn. She hadn't walked these halls when Dorian stayed up all night sanding floors. She hadn't heard him declare, half laughing, half serious, "This house is our fortress, Claudine." I closed the album and pressed it against my chest. Losing this place wouldn't just mean surrendering wood and stone. It would mean erasing him every trace of the life we carved together. I could not, would not allow that. I whispered into the stillness, the words carrying like a vow. "You won't bury me before my time." With the album still in my arms, I sat in the old armchair by the window, the same one Dorian used to read from. The night outside lay heavy, but inside the decision had already taken root. Tomorrow, I would call Gideon again. The phone rang just after sunrise, its shrill cry dragging me from uneasy sleep. Gideon's voice was grave when I answered, and before I could steady myself with coffee, he dropped the weight I had dreaded. "Claudine, I've uncovered something worse," he said. "A loan application was submitted last month, using your name and signature. The bank flagged it because the handwriting didn't quite match. They contacted me since I'm listed as your attorney of record." I gripped the receiver so tightly my knuckles whitened. "You're saying someone forged my hand?" "Yes," he confirmed. "And the documentation points toward Maribel and Ethan. They used information only a family member would know." The words hollowed me out. My own daughter. My blood willing to sign away the roof above me as if I were already gone. My heart pounded, and for a moment I thought the house itself tilted under the blow. Images of her as a child filled my mind, Maribel curled in my lap with fever, her small arms around my neck, whispering that I was her safest place. How had that girl become this woman who looked at me and saw only profit? My breath caught between fury and grief. I wanted to march to her house that instant, slam the forged papers on her polished table, and demand an answer. Yet Gideon's caution lingered in my ear. Proof mattered more than anger. I forced my hands to still, laying the receiver down gently, though every muscle screamed for action. Silence, I decided, would be my weapon. I would let her think her scheme invisible, while I gathered every thread she had left dangling. Knowledge would be my power, and patience my shield. I drew the curtains wide, letting the morning sun flood the parlor. Its light struck the family photos on the mantel, faces frozen in a past that no longer existed. My daughter had chosen her path, and now I would choose mine. With steadying breath, I reached for Gideon's card. Tomorrow, we would speak again, and this time, it would be about war. After Gideon's warning, I drove to his office the next morning, the old building on Broad Street standing like a sentinel among glass towers. He ushered me inside without delay, and I could see in his eyes that he already knew my answer. "Do you remember?" he began gently. "What we put in place after Dorian passed?" I nodded. The memory was clear me at this same oak table, grief-stricken. Gideon guiding me through papers I barely comprehended at the time. At his urging, I had signed the documents for a living trust. The house, the savings account, even the small life insurance policy, all had been placed beyond casual reach. Gideon had been named executor. At the time, it had felt like another burden. Today, it felt like deliverance. "She can't touch it," he assured me. not without your consent. Whatever she forged was smoke and nothing more. The words steadied me. But I knew reassurance alone wasn't enough. Then we change it, I said. Maribel forfeited her place the moment she raised her hand against me. I want it clear that she will receive nothing. Gideon studied me for a long moment, perhaps measuring whether bitterness or resolve spoke louder. And who will you name? I thought of Isolde, her trembling hand pressing that napkin into mine at the dinner table, her wide eyes carrying more courage than any child should need. My granddaughter, I said firmly, everything to her. The pen felt heavy as I signed the amendments, each stroke finalizing a decision that both freed and wounded me. Relief coursed through me, but sorrow clung as well. Choosing legacy over blood was no triumph, only necessity. When the papers were sealed, Gideon touched my hand with quiet respect. You've protected what matters. I stepped out into the pale winter sunlight, the weight on my chest a little lighter, though the ache of loss pulsed beneath it. Maribel had set her course, and now so had I. The battle was no longer about fear, but about preparation, and the next gathering would bring the reckoning into the open. Sunday arrived with the kind of brittle cold that keeps families indoors, crowded around heavy tables. I carried my resolve into Maribel's living room, where cousins and aunts were already trading polite chatter. The smell of roast beef lingered in the air, but my appetite had long since deserted me. I waited until plates were full and voices had settled into comfortable rhythm. Then I cleared my throat and drew from my bag the folder Gideon had prepared. There is something I must say, I began, my tone steady enough to hush the room. Maribel's smile froze. Mother, perhaps now isn't. It is exactly the time. I laid the papers flat. This house of mine, and every dollar I earned beside Dorian, has been in a trust for years. Gideon is executor. You have no claim. Gasps rippled. Gideon, seated at the far end, nodded once in solemn confirmation. Color drained from Maribel's face. That's ridiculous, she snapped, her voice shrill. You're confused. You don't understand what you're saying. Before I could answer, Ethan shifted in his chair. We only. He bit the words off too late, his slip slicing the air. Every eye turned to him. Maribel whirled on him, but the damage was done. Her composure crumbled further when Isolde, pale and trembling, stood from her chair. Tears streaked her cheeks. I heard you, she sobbed. You said you'd put Grandma in assisted living, that it would be faster that way. The room stilled as if the walls themselves recoiled. Relatives stared. Horrified, Maribel lunged toward her daughter, but Isolde stepped back into the circle of an aunt's protective arm. I rose, letting silence weigh a moment longer. You wanted my house, I said, voice even, cold as stone. You'll never step foot in it again. Maribel's protest tangled with Ethan's stammering, a desperate chorus already ignored. The family had seen enough. I gathered the folder back into my bag. The decision carved in stone now, and knew the reckoning was no longer private, but complete. The aftermath came swifter than even I expected. By Monday, whispers of the forgery had turned into open talk. Maribel's name was passed around the church pews like a cautionary tale, and at the grocery store, no one lingered to greet her. Invitations dried up. Friends who once filled her calendar suddenly found excuses. The hollow pride she carried through our town collapsed under the weight of truth. Ethan fared no better. His employer, unwilling to be tied to scandal, dismissed him the same week. Word of falsified signatures and financial deceit clung to him, and whatever bravado he once wore drained from his face when he passed me on Main Street. He couldn't even lift his eyes. Through it all, Isolde bore the brunt of her parents' unraveling silence and fury. One evening, she appeared on my porch with a single suitcase and tear-streaked cheeks. She whispered, I can't stay there anymore. I gathered her into my arms without hesitation. The house, once so quiet, found new rhythm with her presence. She set her school books on the kitchen table, helped me with supper, and lingered in the parlor in the evenings, her laughter tentative at first, then fuller as days passed. Slowly, dignity that had been threatened began to bloom again, this time not through wealth or walls, but through the bond between us. I saw in her eyes both apology and determination, as though she carried the burden of her parents' choices, yet refused to repeat them. It steadied me. Where one branch had rotted, another grew strong. Each morning as I brewed coffee, I felt less the ache of betrayal and more the quiet strength of renewal. And with Isolde under my roof, I knew the house would not echo with loneliness when the final act came. The earth was cool beneath my gloves as I pressed a young rose bush into place, its roots drinking in the soil of the garden Dorian once tended. The morning sun gilded the edges of the Victorian house, and beside me Isolde sat on the porch steps with a book open in her lap. She looked up now and then to ask a question, her voice bright, her presence steady. For the first time in years, the air around me felt light. The sharp edges of betrayal had dulled into something manageable, like an old scar that no longer throbbed. I breathed deeply and realized I had been living too long with the weight of ties that drained instead of nourished. I wiped the dirt from my hands and leaned on the spade, looking at the house with fresh eyes. Every board, every stone, carried the story of my life, nights of worry, mornings of joy, the echoes of a man who had once promised me forever. I had feared losing it would mean losing myself. Now I saw the truth. I had been its keeper, and in turn, it had kept me. Isolde glanced up and smiled. And in that small gesture, I understood the meaning of legacy. It was not money or property alone, but the values carried forward, the dignity preserved. I had chosen her, not out of anger, but because she had shown courage when it mattered most. I was never just her mother. I murmured, voice low but certain. I am a woman who built my own legacy. The garden seemed to nod with me, alive and blooming despite all that had been threatened. Love without respect is not love, it's debt, and I will never pay that bill again.